Good evening, everybody. I will dive into the presentation without much ado. The slide just simply captures the essence of the challenge and the opportunity that we are looking at as an economy in terms of need for infra investment, and that gives us the background, the bedrock, or the context of this presentation. The purpose of the discussion is to share with you certain developments which seem to have taken place over the last couple of years, which have certainly given a fillip to the overall investment scenario in the country and lends credence to the hope that things are on the mend. I will not read the data. This presentation at the end would be available, and if you drop in a line, I will be happy to send the PDF copies. No difficulty. Now, in terms of the issues at hand, and I will move straight into it, all I wanted to point out was that since around 3 years back, 2 years back, we had seen a slowdown in capital formation, maybe 3 years now, and investments in infrastructure. From $1 trillion target for 12th plan, it was downsized by 40%. Last 2 years have shown improved investments, and we seem to have come back to around 70% of the target in rupee terms. So instead of 50.7 lakh crores, we expect to have an investment of 39 lakh crores. Be that as may, there are challenges and opportunities that lie. And I think the biggest issue at hand is that the recent CRISIL report seems to suggest, which was covered in media yesterday, day before, that in the 13th plan we will need another 43 trillion rupees, or 43,000 crore rupees, for investment in infrastructure over 5 years, 70% of which will come in power, transport, and urban infrastructure. These will be all long-term contracts, and these will all have the challenges that we are going to talk. The context of the discussion, and pointedly this will be relevant for us to then appreciate the challenge, is that infrastructure projects inherently are projects which are created, operated, and function for the purpose of the consumption by citizen and used by the economy. These are not projects which are meant for somebody's personal consumption. They therefore deliver something which is known as public good or service. The most important factor not to be forgotten ever is that these projects and these contracts relate to fundamental needs of a citizen or an economy and constitute state's obligation at the basic level. A provision of water supply, electricity, education, telecommunication services, road transport, highways, etc., are all functions which the state would have taken and has, after 91, also allowed private sector participation, whether in PPP mode or in joint ventures or purely private. These inherently involve grant of concessions. So invariably will allow use of some scarce resource or natural resource of the country, be that mineral or like coal, oil and gas, spectrum, or be it utilization of lands and right of way, etc. So under the circumstances, they have a public element involved. Third, very important point which people seem to forget, irrespective of whether it's a private sector or a public sector project, it involves high upfront capital investments, out of which 75 to 85% is funded by the debt which comes from public financial institutions, and largely in India from public banks, public sector banks, which hold your and my money as taxpayer. The challenge that India faces is that the tenure of loan in the long term is not more than 8 to 12 years. Against an asset life which could go in an airport up to 60 years, in a power plant 30, 35, and as such, the challenge of repayment leads to an issue of front loading of the tariff. Now, normally that becomes a challenge because the costs early on become high, and after you've retired the debt, the facility or the service or the product is costed cheaper. So there is some amount of challenge there. It has to be paid purely from the tariff which is collected from the consumers of the service, and or subsidy which is basically taxpayer money. It is not for free. I think that's the most important point to remember. The big challenge in that context, in context of the last slide, is that there is a mindset of risk in context of private capital. And that mindset is seen across the board, particularly whether it is policymakers, regulators, governments, banks, everybody. We need to be mindful that once money has been invested, this is all regulated. And in fact, at the stage of investment itself, and this is very important, all infrastructure sectors, by law and policy, are vested in state. They are regulated either by regulators like the electricity regulators, the telecommunication regulators, the airport regulator, or they are regulated by the ministries and the government departments and statutory authorities like the National Highway Authority of India. And therefore, whether how much is to be invested in what asset, where is it located, and what will it give as a service or a good, what quantity and quality of that service will be provided, or what size of the highway and what nature will be created, how will it be priced in terms of usage, how much loan, how much equity, to whom can it be provided, to whom can it be denied, and what terms, what kind of return can be earned, including whether somebody can exit and at what value, are all regulated by the government or economic regulators. Therefore, it is important to remember that when you have a long-term contract to create a facility which is inherently for the utilization and benefit of a citizen or an economy, it is very important to remember that the good of the facility must always be completed in time, as far as possible, be never shut down, and be made available, whatever be the underlying challenges. That is one area where we have some challenges in terms of the issue of long-term contracts, and I will come to it in a moment. But these are the factors which are very critical to bear in mind. Then on, it is very important for us to remember that since 1947 and the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948 was the first instance, there were laws and policies which vested the entire infrastructure and most of the economy in what was known as the commanding heights of the economy and public sector. From there, post-91, we have seen an unshackling of that and permission to private sector to come, foreign investment to come, certain conditionalities to be met. Some still require prior approval, some have thresholds beyond which they can come in. But be that as it may, there is still a challenge in terms of private owned operated facilities being looked at with suspicion. And I'm not saying that the private sector doesn't have certain responsibilities to discharge there, but that at times when dealing with challenges does clearly be dealt. Now, when I talk about the issues, and I think we all have witnessed for ourselves circumstances, whether you look at the to the coal, the electricity tariff, challenges, and the spectrum allocation. Disrupted. I am now would like to was the work of Holstrom, which won them the Nobel Prize for Economics for this year 2016. Let's try and see. I'll take you to a set of slides which will show to you how Indian courts have looked at it, and perhaps before coming to Indian courts, let me share with you what the Nobel Prize winners have worked on. So Oliver Hart and Bengt Holstrom have published a series of works, particularly in 1985, 2008, 2015, where they have looked at the factor that there is a need inherently when there is large capital investments, whether in public or private sector, and the quid pro quo of a contract is spread over a period of time to enter into contracts that set detailed rules and sharing of risk and reward amongst the parties involved. This is necessary because there are certain information asymmetries. At the time of bidding or entering into a contract, there is certain inherent incompleteness in the contracts, and there are certain externalities which are unabsorbable. So, I mean, these issues, these words sound daunting, but ultimately what it means is that there is a challenge in terms of the fact that the information that is available with somebody who owns or operates that particular product is higher than the person who buys it. Now, the interesting challenge that arises is, in economics, the information asymmetry is a primary principle on the basis of which industrial organization theory and much of microeconomics and regulatory economics has proceeded. But in law, the principle that is followed in contracts is buyer beware, caveat emptor. Now that brings a bit of a conflict between the two, and therefore it brings challenges in contracts. The reason for incompleteness of contracts is primarily because when there are long-term contracts, it is impossible to predict what is going to happen the next year, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. Illustrations of the nature would be, for example, when the power projects were established on the basis of coal, and the domestic coal policy as well as the throughput of Coal India suddenly fell down, and from a stage where the national coal distribution policy suggested that the plants completed up to a particular date will get 100% coal, landed up with 60, 70, even 50% coal at times. You had now an installed capacity invested at around 4 to 5 crores per megawatt, which was lying unutilized, idle capacity, for which debt had been incurred, which had to be serviced. Now this created a whole challenge of how to deal with it. So long as it is in state ownership, we have found that the regulators and courts and governments have found it easier to deal with the challenge. But where private sector came, there was a contest in terms of whether the private sector was asking for anything over and above what they ought to have been given, or there is a problem in terms of an issue to be addressed, be what it may, by adjustment of tariff. Now, at the end of the day, when there is additional cost incurred, somebody must pay. And that became a big contest, which is still pending in courts. Similarly, you have seen the issue of airports, for example. When Delhi and Mumbai airports, and we are quite proud of the facilities that have been created, they are world class, were being bid out. At that stage, the concession which was given was premised on a particular tariff structure, which was at slight variance with the law which was being brought out. And there was some ambiguity. As a consequence, it led to a situation where people were unclear as to what kind of costs could be incurred and passed on to consumer versus what costs had to be incurred and absorbed by the developer. That led to conflict and difficulties. Now, similarly, in some of the coal and gas-based projects, or for that matter, highway projects, when highways were planned and transmission lines in Lake City were planned, but right-of-way permissions didn't come, Ministry of Environment and Forest came in with notifications, and forest clearance took much longer. And land acquisition became a hurdle that delayed the projects. These are all called externalities, things which are beyond the control of the parties in question, which are beyond the parameters of the contract, but would have a direct impact on the foundation of implementation of a contract. Now, this could be nebulous state of demand, it could be market issues, it could be technology and disruptive technology changes. All of these result in long-term contracts being inherently incomplete. They are also incomplete because there is what is known as bounded rationality. At a given point in time, given the state of the technology, the market, the economy, there is only a certain understanding of the reality. For example, before the 2008 financial crisis, the expectation of foreign debt to be cost at a particular level, the expectation of Indian debt to incur a particular interest went completely out of gear because the financial crisis led to lack of capital available. It also led to enhancement of the interest rate to be paid. So any projects that were planned on the basis of a particular level of interest, say 10%, which was suddenly faced with a 16% interest, had no ability to absorb. Now these situations will arise as the external environment, the macroeconomic environment in the current world will impact the viability of a project. These lead to the situations where you have, with the sunk-in cost and investment and infrastructure created, challenges of how to handle the process and how to operate the project. Now, one conflict that arises is, do we get into a dispute resolution mode allowing people to shut down or walk out of facilities? I don't think we can possibly say that you can stop providing water supply to a city and citizen or Lake City just because there is a contest or a dispute on who should have been given the bid, what should have been the tariff, what quality of supply is necessary. So there is a need to recognize across the board the fact that circumstances keep changing, but certain underlying principles will have to be honored. Now, long-term contracts present certain benefits because of which they are preferred. They save the transaction cost, which I incurred in trying to identify the various options and permutations, combinations and variations, provide for detailed comprehensive contracts, repeated changes, and all of that along with the scope of adjustment in case there is any change because of information asymmetry or externalities. While they do that, they also provide a much longer tenure where parties who enter into contract can see whether they have got due compensation for the risk that they take while ensuring that the project functions viably. So they are preferred for that reason, also screening in terms of somebody's creditworthiness and performance. Similarly, they brought out the basic thought that the transaction costs which are involved in long-term contracts basically relate to these four heads: cost of anticipating all eventualities, providing for them in a comprehensive framework; cost of deciding how to handle and deal with these eventualities; cost of writing a comprehensive contract with all eventualities; and cost of enforcement. And in that, ultimately what they said was that incompleteness arises in long-term contracts due to information asymmetry and imperfect competition, including a lock-in effect of investment. You know, once you've invested 10, 20, 50 crores, you are bound to, as a party, as an investor, as a lender, look at the viability and revenue flow from that. Now, issues of transaction costs of dealing with the legal and the contractual arrangements and the issues of unanticipated externalities, they didn't see problem. And there, they have recommended that the solution is by putting constraints and clauses in the long-term contracts where you can only reset or adjust the economics in certain circumstances. Put a limit that the reset will be within a ceiling or a price cap based on competitively negotiated contracts. That is, nobody can go ahead and renegotiate for himself a much bigger windfall. So after the party has recovered prudent costs that are incurred, which may be altered because of circumstances, his return would be only commensurate to what he had bid and contracted for. And then to allocate decisions and rights or control over assets subject to explicit limitations of this nature. So who will decide this issue, whether it's a regulator, court, or it's through a mechanism otherwise? And in this context, then the Indian courts have over time often seen, and just to disavow you, the law exists since 1954, where Supreme Court has held, the last bullet on the slide, that the term force majeure is a term of wider import, which is intended to save a performing party from consequences of anything over which it does not have control. And if it's impossible, or of the nature where it is commercially impracticable, of performance in a contractual arrangement, in a commercial arrangement, then adjustments will have to be made. These are three judgments I have cited. These judgments have been followed by Appellate Tribunal for Lake City in a full bench decision where the Tata Adani cases were taken. I am just mentioning these cases because ET was very keen that we should highlight the current issues. They are still pending before Supreme Court, and quantification of the losses are being done by a central commission, so I will not like to get into the merits of the matter. I am happy to explain the facts because I represent the parties. But be that as it may, the courts have recognized that in case of shortfall of domestic coal and the spiraling prices of imported coal, it rose to be a situation of force majeure where it caused commercial impracticability and there is a need to compensate. Similarly, a recent decision in Vidarbha Industries, Maharashtra, similar compensation has been granted for cost of imported coal as a pass-through. This follows a Cabinet Committee of Economic Affairs decision on the same point. And then Supreme Court has also said that in situations of force majeure beyond the control of a party, you need to lean in favor of flexibility in resolving problems. Now, having said that, I think the question that arises is then how do you deal with the challenge which comes? And these are my suggested recommended solutions, taking a leaf from the Nobel laureates' work also, that you need a robust contracting regime to allocate scarce natural resources and select concessionaires, which must also deal with the inherently incomplete nature of long-term contracts. So you must have a credible mechanism, a credible process, because to my mind, water supply facility, electricity utility, a highway, an airport are all fundamental facilities which every citizen needs for their welfare and for living a good life. The economy needs for growth. When we are talking of Make in India, Startup India, Stand Up India, all of these are based on the fact that Indian economy will not be inflationary, but will make the Indian entities competitive and effective and efficient. So you need to address them while ensuring that all infrastructure created is utilized fully. And then we need to keep in mind time value for money. So there is a dispute adjudicatory process which must be quick. This becomes very important because if we are not conscious that these matters pending for long, because of which projects can be stalled, can have a much worse effect on the economy than what we'd like to, can create a huge challenge. And if I say that is because unlike UK, for example, where recently we read that the interest rate for the bank is 0.25%. We know that our interest rates can be up to 12 and 14% per annum. We know that our inflation rates are high. And in spite of the fact that we have managed to control and seen growth, if we are not able to decide quickly, if you look at it from the point of view of the life cycle of a project, the life of it is utilized immediately, it is utilized fully, it is duly paid for, and therefore the asset is kept in use and operated fully. In this, it is most important to restore trust and confidence in our assets. And please have a look at some of the issues. I mean, one issue which I'd like to flag out is that we should understand that when invested in infrastructure assets where nobody can walk away with it, and everything is regulated, by ensuring a good, robust, and strong regulatory process with participation of all stakeholders, you can rest assured that whether it's private capital or public capital, with a 70 to 80% money coming from banks, it doesn't matter. What matters is the asset must be used fully, the facility must be available at an affordable price, all citizens must get it. Similarly, it must be recognized there is a time value for money. And I've given you two examples, the telecom migration policy, because of which from upfront royalty payment, we migrated our frameworks to a revenue share, where the government shared in the success and the profitability of the telecom companies. We saw tremendous growth over 10, 12 to 15 years till we came to the 2G judgment, which has created some challenges. Similarly, on the other side, when the Dabhol power plant came into trouble, and as a consequence, there were disputes because of which the asset has been mothballed, literally no generation was done for around 5.5 years. The entire 10,500 crores of investment had to be written off and refinanced. And in spite of the fact that we have two of the most respected public sector utilities which are well regarded internationally operating it, that is National Thermal Power Plant Power Corporation, NTPC, and Gas Authority of India. So all that it shows you is that if capital invested in assets are left fallow, not operational, be it in public hand or private hand, they will lose value and they'll come at the cost of the economy. If you have quick decisions, the contracts will be enforceable in a time-bound manner, and I think we have seen changes with the regulatory processes. We need to empower them. The Arbitration Act amendment suggests that we will have quick decision-making. Similarly, we need to also recognize that the insolvency reforms and the robust refinancing, and I think the RBI has taken some steps, Ministry of Finance is taking some steps, which has put things in motion, should be able to incubate growth back again by bringing capital and taking stranded assets out. I think the most salutary example has been how the highways have been renegotiated and 85% of stuck projects are back online. And at the end of the day, there is a need to provide quick, time-bound, expert reneg processes, whether through courts, regulators, or formulaic approach, like the NHAI has demonstrated, like some electricity utilities are today seeing, and hopefully will see the end of it. Because ultimately, please remember, 1 rupee of electricity axiomatically produces 150 rupees of GDP. And it is not in the interest of the citizens of the economy to shut down a power plant rather than to produce and generate wealth, employment, growth for the economy. So I'll close my talk to you by quoting none other than Kautilya or Chanakya in Arthashastra, where he is quoted to have said, and I, of course, I'm reading from the English translation, that the root of wealth is economic activity, and the lack of it brings material distress. Both current prosperity and future growth will get destroyed. So it's very important that we make sure our infrastructure, once we decide to invest, is created quickly, is operated fully, is utilized effectively, and is never brought to a state of disuse, disrepair, or poor maintenance that will harm the economy. I will close my presentation here, and I will look forward to hearing from you. Any questions, any comments, I am available and will be happy to answer. Thank you.
Our first question from Jatin. With increasing addition of renewable capacity and excess capacity, what are the barriers to exits for conventional generators, and what are their options if they wish to get out of the long-term contracts?
I think the barriers for exit are quite clear. Somebody who's invested in conventional plants, and you're talking about electricity now, obviously they have first a contractual commitment to continue to supply. If they're facing a pressure in terms of the fact that the renewable energy is being dispatched before them, and they're being backed down, normally I would expect that they will be paid deemed generation for the fallow capacity, so long as they are available. And as such, there is no need to exit. If there is a need to renegotiate, you can go back and discuss with the parties in case you're not getting dispatched, because any distribution company would be happy to also get out of a situation where they're incurring these costs. But it will have to be a bilateral negotiation, because right now, I don't think we have reached a stage where the Indian economy has surplus stranded capacity, other than because of transmission constraints and because of fuel challenges, for which they don't want more installation. In fact, the 12th five-year plan had a target of 90,000 and odd megawatts, and we are looking at that. The expectation is that out of the targets that we have had, we have around 25 to 30% of unmet demand, given the level of urban India which is not connected. The growth of smart city and economic growth in terms of other developments will actually, and the manufacturing restart that we've seen in the economy, will have higher demand. We will go through a pain to readjust. There's a need to go back to the regulators and the policymakers. But I don't think it's a situation of despair yet. Thank you.
Next question from Shaurya. What do you think are the gaps in typical solar or wind contracts signed these days?
Well, that's a whole chapter of chats. You have problems from the stage of locational incentives and people squatting on spaces, and thereafter the regulators going back on RPOs and RECs, and therefore the feeding tariff challenges in terms of viability. But I mean, if we are really going to sit and chat about them, then I think this requires a discussion of this framework, because I don't know how many people are familiar with the PPAs and the PSAs and the whole economics of solar PV plant versus the other and the wind energy. So perhaps we can take it offline, or if you want, please drop in a mail and we'll be happy to respond.
Next question from Rashmi. How have the government regulations in India dealing with the sanctity of infrastructure contracts evolved over years?
If you look at the slide that I presented in the inserts, and as I said that I'll be happy to send it across to ET and they can share it with all of you. There are judgments since 1954-56 which I cited. I'll just quickly look at my note. Yeah, the first judgment is 1954 1 SCR, where these issues were duly provided for. So it's not as if the courts and the contractual arrangements don't provide. The clauses of force majeure, the clauses of change in law, the clauses of tariff reset normally do take care.